My name is George Payne, and today I'm doing the oral history of former Judge Paul Jennings, who spent a long time on the federal bench here and is now in private practice. So with that, let's get started. Paul, if you could state your full name and when you were born.
Paul Edmund Jennings, October the 5th, 1938.
And where did you grow up, Paul?
Grew up in Christiana, Tennessee, which is in Rutherford County, from about halfway between Murfreesboro and Shelbyville.
And I suspect that was rural back then as opposed to now.
Rural back then, that's right. Lived on a farm.
And what did your dad do?
My dad was a postal employee, a rural mail carrier, and was for 38 years.
Was that a political job back then? How did he get that appointment?
Well, yes, it was more or less of a political appointment. I don't really remember exactly how much politics was involved, but I can remember that then our congressional representative was Albert Gore Sr., and I know that he was involved.
I just remember that was a sought-after position
Yes.
and made you a visible
Yes.
member of the
Right.
community. What did your mom do?
My mother was a elementary school teacher. She taught the 3rd grade. She did not start teaching until I guess I was in the 9th grade or so. But she had been, she'd graduated from Middle Tennessee State and had taught before and went back to teaching in the 3rd grade and then taught for, well, I guess, 30-some odd years.
And Middle Tennessee was originally a teaching school, wasn't it? Or a
That
school
is
for
correct.
teachers?
That is correct. It was Middle Tennessee
Normal,
I believe.
something
is what
like
it, yeah.
that. Did you have siblings?
Did not.
Okay, only child. And did you go to school there?
The first 10 years of my educational background was at Christiana High School, or Christiana School. At that time, Rutherford County had a number of small high schools like Christiana and Walter Hill and Rockvale and Las Casas. Since that time, they've all been merged into much larger, just 4-year schools. But at that point, there were 12-year schools, very small. In fact, I think there may have been 17 or 18 in my class.
And what did you work at all during
No,
your...
never worked off the farm, but always worked on the farm. My grandfather lived on an adjoining farm, my mother's mother and dad, and he was a farmer, milked cows and raised crops and so forth, and so I always spent my summers working on the farm, and some of that was in the pre-tractor days, so we were operating with horses.
I suspect this is a good inducement to do something else other than farming.
Had a lot to do with me wanting to pursue other endeavors, although I moved back to that same farm and still have both my dad's place and my grandfather's place, so I guess I never got away from it, but at the time I was making decisions about going to college and so forth. My one goal was to get off of the farm.
And what about your paternal grandparents? What do you remember about them or know?
They lived in Watertown, Tennessee. My grandfather owned a hardware store, American hardware store in Watertown for years, and was subsequently operated by an aunt and uncle until finally the big box stores ran most of the small hardware stores out. Prior to that time, he had been a undertaker, which had a lot to do, I think, with my dad going to Cumberland University and then to Middle Tennessee to get a college education, because he determined, as did my uncle, that they wanted nothing to do with the undertaking business.
I've always heard that the hardware store was the natural person, the owner, to be an undertaker because they made the caskets, and that was fairly typical. Is there any truth to that, or have you ever heard that?
No, I really don't know how he got into the undertaking business. He sold out just before I have much recollection of that. But the undertaking facility was upstairs above the hardware store. But I don't know that he ever made, I don't know whether he ever made any caskets or boxes or not.
Mm-hmm. And in high school, what do you want to tell us about that? Did you have extracurricular activities?
Well,
Did you play sports?
Not a whole lot, to be honest with you. I was never big enough to be very good at basketball. Of course, at Christiana, I only had basketball and baseball. Now, I did play baseball. I was a left-handed second baseman. Couldn't hit a thrown ball, but also by the same token, I could field anything that was hit. But I was not a great hitter, and I wasn't big enough to play basketball. And then when I transferred to Central in the 11th grade, my mother was insistent that I go to Central because the high school curriculum at Christiana was so limited. Didn't have chemistry, didn't have physics, didn't have advanced math and things of that nature. Didn't have biology, as a matter of fact. In fact, when I went to Murfreesboro Central, I had to take biology and chemistry in my junior year in high school. But I wasn't very active in anything extracurricular in that regard or in sports. I've always said that my move from Christiana High School to Murfreesboro Central High School was about as big a change in my life than as it was from going from high school to college. We all think about the difference in going from high school to college, but it wasn't but 10 miles down the road, but it was quite a different experience from the rural background that I had experienced.
So you went from the country to the city?
I went from the country to the city, that's right.
How'd you get there?
My mother was teaching at a city school, Murfreesboro, Mitchell Nielsen, which was a part of the Murfreesboro City School system. And so she took me every day. And after I got to be 16, then I took her and then picked her up every afternoon.
And within the high school time period, was there anyone particularly who was influential in your life or that you remember particularly?
Not particularly, other than my parents and grandparents. Not particularly any adult. I had some friendships that I developed at Murfreesboro Central that were quite influential during that period of time, and then later in college. One was my second cousin, who also lived in Christiana and had transferred to Central for his sophomore year. So he was already there. He was, I would say, influential. And then there were a couple of fellows that I met there that.
So it's mostly peer influence.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Before we move on to college, do you remember the war years at all? You would have been 8 or.
Yeah. Yes, I remember them quite vividly. Because in our part of Rutherford County, there were significant maneuvers in that area, the blues and the reds, and I can remember the soldiers camping out front. They were in pursuit of the blues or whichever side they were, up through some of the back parts of my grandfather's farm in particular. I also remember that my father was quite good at raising cantaloupe and watermelon. He loved those and was good at raising them. And I guess he had a half-acre patch or so. And about that time, the maneuvers started, and one morning he went up there and then completely cleaned the patch out. They had quite a feast.
Well, having been in the Army, I understand
You can understand.
That's an age-old tradition.
Right.
Were they out of Camp Forest?
I think they were out of Camp Forest. Was that in Tullahoma?
Right.
Yeah.
But there were a huge number of people there.
Yes.
And apparently they had the ability to go anywhere where they wanted on the maneuvers, and they must have caused damage. You remember?
The raid of the watermelon patch was the only damage that enters my mind. I don't remember them doing any damage to fences or anything like that. I don't remember any of the livestock getting out as a result. But yeah, they came through with those jeeps and tanks and trucks, and pretty well went wherever they wanted. We had some land that was quite on the back part of both my dad's place and my grandfather's. It was quite rocky and trees and so forth, and they patrolled those areas pretty good.
Mm-hmm. Well, it must have been impressive to see.
It was very impressive to an 8-year-old to see those guys.
Okay, after Central, you went to Georgia Tech, didn't you?
Went to Georgia Tech.
Why Georgia Tech, and what?
Well, strangely enough, there were, I believe, 4 in my graduating class. I think there were like 128 or 30 in the graduating class. And 4 of us went to Georgia Tech. I guess the fact that those 2 or 3 other guys were going, but I can remember quite vividly that really the reason I decided I wanted to be an engineer was the fact that it was known that engineers made $500 a month. And I thought that $500 a month sounded like all the money in the world.
Where did you learn that?
I don't know where I heard that, but I guess in reading or talking to the advisors or whomever, it turned up that they made that kind of money, and that sure did sound a whole lot better than the farm.
What was Georgia Tech like?
Georgia Tech was an interesting place. Of course, in Atlanta, and you can imagine this was in 1956. Things certainly weren't integrated in those days. And I went as a what they referred to as a co-op student. And the co-op students lived in absolutely the worst dumpy dorm that anybody has ever can imagine. The other thing that I remembered very vividly was this was, I suppose, shortly after Castro may have taken assumed power in Cuba, and there were just hundreds of Cuban students at Georgia Tech at that time. Of course, it was a great football school in those days. That was the Bobby Dodd era and the Bob Nealon era and University of Tennessee, and that was a great part of it. And there were very few women at Georgia Tech at that time.
Was Sophie Newcomb a sister school, or wasn't there a sister school?
Yes, there was.
And
and Sophie Newcomb doesn't sound right.
Maybe
Agnes
that was
Scott.
Agnes Scott.
Agnes
Sophie
Scott,
Newcomb
yes.
was
Agnes
Tulane
Scott.
down.
That's
right.
correct.
Okay. And I didn't even realize there were any girls at Georgia Tech.
If there were, they were very few.
And how did a co-op student differ from an ordinary
Co-op student, it was a 5-year program, and you went to school a quarter and worked a quarter. And they had relationships with various industries. I ended up with E.I. DuPont in their nylon plant in Chattanooga. It is primarily to, assist with the financial part and also to give you some practical experience. Good program. I learned rather quickly that I liked social studies and history and things of that nature much better than I liked the math and science that engineers had to go through.
Is this the reason you ended up at Vanderbilt?
Yes.
And what was that process, or how did that occur?
Well, initially, I had a cousin that was a student at Baylor University in Waco, and I thought that I wanted to go out there, but just at the last moment, I decided no, I didn't really think I wanted to go to Waco, Texas, and so you'll appreciate this, particularly in light of today's Vanderbilt. My mother and father and I were in Nashville for some reason, and I said, well, I think let's drive by Vanderbilt. I might get a application form and think about enrolling in Vanderbilt. Well, we went by Kirkland Hall. Of course, Vanderbilt was a lot different in 1958 than it is today, but the admissions office and so forth were in there, and I went in and asked questions and talked to someone in there, and before I left, I was admitted, and they didn't have transcripts or anything. Vanderbilt reportedly was a little more difficult to get in, but as a transfer student, they asked very few questions, and I suppose they had already weeded out enough people that they needed some extra juniors and seniors.
Did they offer you any scholarship money?
No, I did not get any offer. Tuition and at that time was $400 a semester.
Did you just go back to the car and say,
Yeah,
I'm gonna admit?
Yeah, I said, well, I think this might be all right.
And what was your parents' reaction?
Well, my parents were always very understanding, or that was one area that they gave me a lot of freedom in. They never tried to push me to one place or the other. Didn't really offer any great support that that was a good idea, but didn't really try to talk me out of it or anything.
Tell us something about your time at Vanderbilt.
Well, in the undergraduate school, I majored in political science and history. Have to admit that history was what I was really interested in, but I sat down one day. You probably remember that you periodically would stop and study the catalogs for various and sundry reasons to see which courses you had to take in order to get out as quickly as you could. And sometime in my second semester there, I sat down and looked at the catalog and saw that with the credits that I'd been given from Georgia Tech, and of course had very little except English, and I think there was maybe one social studies class that I'd taken there that would transfer. And I'd picked up a few credits at MTSU one summer that if I went to summer school, I could graduate at the end of my 4th year. And so that kind of made me think that, you know, maybe political science is what I want to major in, and of course I can get out on time and minor in history. I was a member of a fraternity there. By that time, I'd become the great athlete. Wasn't any bigger, but you know, I had intramurals and so forth, and played softball, and was a quarterback on the football team, and was a guard, and you can imagine that the record that we had was toward the bottom if I was the best they had to offer in that regard. But lived in the dorm in the first year, and then moved over to the fraternity house the second year, which I suspect was a mistake, but anyway, it was fun.
Which fraternity was it?
Phi Kappa Sigma. And the reason, well, and one of the reasons I guess I thought about Vanderbilt was one of my closest friends at Murfreesboro Central, well, 2 of them as a matter of fact. One was Bud Young, who just died last month, whose father owned the Murfreesboro Pure Milk Company, Purity, and subsequently was part of Purity Dairies, and then Henry Butler, who was going to medical school, was there, and then another couple of people from Murfreesboro Central were there, and Bud was active in lots of things at Vanderbilt, and he was the president of the fraternity and so forth, and so I guess that's the reason I ended up at Phi Kappa Sigma, and I think my senior year I was the vice president or something, I don't know. Oh, I was a social chairman for, at one period of time, which was always a good indicator.
So in addition to developing into athletic mediocrity, you became a social fraternity man.
Yes, I think I was much better at the social aspect than I was the athletics, to be honest.
Okay, so after 2 years, you graduated.
I graduated after 2 years, and really had not even thought about getting a job. As we go through this, you'll be amazed at how many times I never thought about getting a job. But I was walking down the hall one day, my senior, I guess this is the last semester, and Dr. Wilder Crane came up to me and said, would you be interested in going to graduate school next year and on a fellowship, work sort of a fellowship? And I thought, well, I don't have anything else to do. Surely to goodness a graduate degree wouldn't hurt anything, and so based on that, I run over and apply to the to get into graduate school. Now, I should say, I think that I had applied to law school, again, with the idea being that I didn't have a job and I might as well do something, and surely 3 years of law school would be worth something. And in fact, had received a scholarship. But I decided, yeah, that sounded good. So I went to graduate school the year after I graduated, and that would have been 1960, I guess. So in 61, I went to the graduate school to get a master's in political science.
Dr. Crane, had he been an advisor or a teacher?
No, he'd been a teacher.
Oh.
He had been one of my teachers, yes. One of the people, I guess, that was influential in me thinking about law school and influential in my ultimately going to law school was Dr. Robert Harris, who taught constitutional law and was just a fantastic professor and lecturer. And constitutional law had captured my interest, and knowing as little as I did about most everything, but particularly law, I thought, well, now maybe I ought to be a constitutional lawyer or something like that. But though he was very influential in that regard, and Dr. Crane, I'd taken courses with Dr. Crane, and
your grades must have been fairly good if they were asking you to do
reasonable.
this.
Yes, you know, I was not a stellar, outstanding student, but you know, I did pretty well. I was very, very adept at staying up all night the night before the exams and absorbing most of the things that I didn't have time to forget them because I only read them for the first time the night before.
That was the good thing about political science, as I recall.
It is indeed. And I soon learned in graduate school that those guys that were in graduate school at Vanderbilt getting PhDs, most of them, were really kind of out of my league. They talked a different language and asked a lot of different sorts of questions than had ever occurred to me. And I decided that if I ever got this master's degree, I believe I'd quit there. I would say one thing, talking about the undergraduate. When I transferred to Vanderbilt, of course, it was to get a Bachelor of Arts, and that required 2 years of a foreign language. At Georgia Tech, I don't know if they even had a foreign language department or not. So I had 2 years of French. Now that was something that I was not made for French, or at least the effort that I put into it indicated to me. The only way I got out was there was a lady that taught French, and she was from France. She could not speak English. The word got out that if you took French, and I do not remember the lady's name now, she had to give you a C. And the reason she had to give you a C was she couldn't speak English, so she couldn't communicate with you any more than you could communicate with her. And indeed that was true. And consequently, my third and fourth semester of second year French, I planned my whole schedule around being able to get in her class.
So even though Christiana was your native tongue, you did get 2 years of French.
I got through 2 years of French, but.
Okay, let's talk about law school and
all right.
Who was in your class or the classes around you who ended up practicing in Nashville, who you remember, and your law professors.
The persons that I remember that ended up practicing in Nashville were Brad Reed, who went to Bassberry and Sims. Brad was one of the smartest people I think that I had come into contact with at that point. Brad finished first in our graduating class and held the highest grade at Vanderbilt for many years. I'm sure it's been surpassed now. But the other person was Russ Morris. Russ and Brad both went to Brassberry and Sims.
Russ was a former football player, wasn't he?
Russ was a former quarterback, yeah, at Vanderbilt, and I believe had married Henny.
My first
Benedict.
cousin.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Did being quarterback help him at the law school?
No, I don't know that it did.
How disappointing.
That's right. I don't think it did. Russ was pretty bright fella. He was not. He didn't have to depend on football to get by.
Who were the professors that?
All the professors, the ones that are most memorable, I guess, was Dr. Paul Hartman, who was the person that sort of trained the law students. Dean John Wade, who was nationally recognized as a tort expert and professor and writer. Elliot Cheatham, who was wrote in the ethics and conflicts of law area. One of my favorite people was Leo Raskin. Leo Raskin had a PhD from the London School of Economics and a law degree from Yale. And he taught tax too, which I never understood. Herman Troutman taught tax 1, and he was totally different than Mr. Raskin, Dr. Raskin. Somehow Dr. Raskin and I kind of hit things off, but the one thing that you'll appreciate, Lou Connor was in that class also, and Lou was taking tax 2, and I never shall forget that. Raskin asked me a question one day. He went through a long, that was corporate tax, you know, and he went through something, and I didn't have a clue what the man was talking about. And so I sat there and I didn't say anything much, and he said, "Exactly right, Mr. Jennings. The answer is nothing." That was my greatest performance in tax 2, and didn't even realize it.
Now, you mentioned Lou Connor. Anyone else?
Lou was the class before me.
Okay.
Lou, the other fellow, guy that was in the class before me, you would know, that was a West representative for so long, that endowed the chair out at Vanderbilt because he made so much money selling books at West. I'll think of his name in a minute, but I later had a lot of contact with him. I can see his face and can't call his name. Carlton Tarkington. Mm-hmm. Carlton and I had a lot of contact after I became a bankruptcy judge. That was before West had entered into the publishing of Bankruptcy Reporter. At that point, I'm jumping ahead of you now just a minute, but CCH and somebody else were publishing bankruptcy decisions. That was before Collier. No, I guess Collier had begun.
There was a bankruptcy reporter,
yes,
or
that was it.
Bankruptcy court decisions.
That's it.
With Newell Blair,
That's
who went to Swanee, which was an odd connection. And he was in Washington.
Right. That's right. That's exactly right. Now West hadn't started this, and I don't know. Carlton had sold me a bunch of books, I guess, when I was a magistrate, and I started talking to Carlton that, you know, West Publishing Company ought to get into the bankruptcy world because it produces lots of opinions and lots of cases and so forth. Carlton, I think, had quite a bit of influence by that time with West Publishing because of his sales. I mean, he was a salesman. And Carlton was in the class with Lou, I believe. I'm sure some other people will come to mind.
So graduation time came, and you have told us earlier you didn't really focus on what you were going to do.
Right.
Where were you at this point?
Graduation time came, and it was at least February or March, and I still hadn't gotten around to looking for a job. And
when did you graduate in?
I graduated in '64.
Okay.
I got my back to my graduate school events. I kept working on a thesis, but I never quite got involved in writing that thesis. I'd gotten influenced by one of the professors, Dr. Bernard Gordon, who, for some reason unknown, thought that writing my thesis on CETO, Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, would be a great idea. And I did some background research, and of course, you know, by that time, Southeast Asia was becoming much involved, as you learned all too well. But I never got down to doing that. And again, I started studying the catalog, and I came up with this program that Vanderbilt had called Masters of Arts in Teaching. And I remember my mother was very insistent that since I'd invested a year and some of their money into a graduate degree, that I really needed to go ahead and get a piece of paper to show for that. She was good at doing those kind of things. And so I decided, well, now, you know, the easy way out of this, because I won't have to take I won't have to write that paper, is to get a Master's of Arts in Teaching. Now, I had gone to summer school between my first and second, and between my second and third, so I graduated from law school at the end of the first semester. So I used the second semester to take a bunch of courses at George Peabody College, which Vanderbilt had formed an association with by that time, and get all the education courses that a man needed for being able to be a secondary education, and did practice teaching and all those kind of things. And so I got my law degree in 1964 in May or June, whenever we graduated, and also my Master's of Art in Teaching. But back to the question you asked me, I hadn't done a whole lot about seeking employment in either field. And one of my close friends that had started to law school at the same time I did, which was, he was a year younger than I because I'd taken that graduate year. Peter Winders had applied, and had Judge Harry Phillips had appointed Pete as his law clerk for the upcoming 64-65 year. Pete was he was law review. He was bright, but Pete and I were close, and Pete decided to go to Florida, Tampa, as I recall, and start practicing law. And so, about March or April
of 1964. Oh, 64. Okay.
Mm-hmm. He calls Judge Phillips up and tells Judge Phillips that he's going to go to Florida to practice law. Of course, that left Judge Phillips in kind of a tight spot because people usually hired their law clerks in the fall or early spring, and now he didn't have a law clerk. And of course, I knew what was going on with Pete, and after he had called Judge Phillips, my father and Judge Phillips had gone to high school together at Watertown, and then had gone to Cumberland for a couple of years. Back in the days, when Judge Phillips graduated from law school, Cumberland had a one-year law school. So Judge Phillips had graduated from Cumberland Law School. That caused people, by the way, as an aside, to come in from all over the United States because Cumberland had that one-year law school. And cause I remember Judge Phillips, he was the greatest fellow in the world at keeping up with his contacts and so forth. And Cumberland at that point had more senators and members of the House of Representatives than any school in the nation. But anyway, Judge Phillips and my dad had been great friends at high school, and so I called Judge Phillips, and I said, well, I understand that Peter Winters has decided to go practice law, and I said, what about me being your law clerk? And Judge Phillips said, well, says, you know, I've been tracking your career at law school. And
do you believe he had?
and indeed he had. And he said, you know, you haven't done bad. You haven't done badly. I would have called you and offered you the job if you'd done just a little bit better than that. But, you know, under the circumstances, said, come on down here and we'll talk about it.
So all of this was over the telephone?
All of this was over the telephone. That's right.
And you just cold called him?
I called him after I knew that Pete was not going to be his law clerk.
And they just had one at that point?
At that point, they had only had one law clerk.
Okay.
Harvey Couch was his first law clerk, who was also a brain and went on to teach law school at Tulane. And Peter Winters was going to be his second one.
Where was his office?
Judge Phillips' office was on the 6th floor of the federal courthouse.
The Kefauver building.
The Kefauver building, that's correct. At that point, I don't know what they do now. I think it's probably maybe somewhat the same. The judges would then go to Cincinnati 5 times a year for 3 weeks, and they have 3-week sessions, and then come back every other month, really, starting, I believe it was in October, maybe October, December, and so forth.
Would he take you,
yeah,
the log?
Yeah. We would leave on the Sunday before the court started on Monday, and we'd be there 3 weeks.
And would you eat your meals with him, stay in the same hotel?
No, we stayed in the same hotel and so forth, but we normally didn't eat meals together. The judges, I believe there were 5 other judges on the court at that time, 4 or 5. The law clerks always ate together, but we saw him from 8 o'clock till 4 o'clock, except the judges sometimes would leave a little early. But those were the hours. Those were the days. If you had a pre-hearing memo that you needed to prepare and have to go back, we would go back to the courthouse that housed the 6th Circuit Court of Appeals and just walk in the walk in the courthouse and go up to the whatever floor we were on, third or fourth floor.
Now, Harry Phillips from afar was the quintessential Southern gentleman. Talk a little bit about him, what he required of you, how you prepared him for court after the decision, whether he talked to you about the case, and what he asked of you to prepare orders, since
Right.
a lot of a law clerk's job today is preparing bench memos and
Right,
and
right. Well, and Judge Phillips had pretty much those same requirements. He always wanted a memoranda of the 3 cases that were being heard that morning. He wanted you to you know, give your analysis. He wanted that to be rather short. Certainly Judge Phillips read the briefs beforehand, but he wanted the input of the law clerk on a, you know, 2 or 3 page memoranda.
that must have been heady stuff for someone right out of law school.
It was. It really was. And I remember when I first went out and talked to Judge Phillips about it, that one of the things that concerned me was the fact they had a world of labor relations matters, and I had no background at all in labor law. I think I did take workers' comp from Bob Covington at the law school, but didn't have any background at all. And he assured me, well, you know, you probably can handle that, but yes, we do have a lot of labor relations matters. We had a lot of Social Security matters. One of the biggest cases that we had involved a patent matter with all of the drug companies, Pfizer and everybody involved, that was set specially, as I recall, on a Saturday, all day. Now, normally the limitations were an hour for each side had 30 minutes to argue their case on a matter that was before the Court of Appeals, but they put that one on. It was on all day, and I should say that in that particular case, Judge Phillips drew the opinion. Never asked me to do anything on that, and wrote a 150-page opinion.
So his was the opinion the other judges
His was
signed.
the opinion that the other judges considered and concurred in. And Judge Phillips wrote all of his opinions on a yellow legal pad in pencil. He never dictated anything. He would sit with his yellow pad and write the opinion out, and he wrote that opinion out himself.
Then did he give it to a secretary?
He gave it to his secretary to type. Now, if he was a quote, he would mark the places. I mean, he didn't write out the legal quotations that he was going to use. As far as his law clerk was concerned, if he asked you to write a memoranda, and he frequently did that. I mean, he would assign us, assign the law clerk plenty of things to keep them busy. I always made the comment that Judge Phillips, I believe, could keep an Army battalion busy. But he always wanted you to write your memoranda in the form of an opinion, just as if you were writing it. And then he would take that memoranda and get his legal pad out. He would write his opinion from that. You know, if he thought you wrote a paragraph that he accepted, which was not too often, he would mark that for the secretary to insert. But no one, I don't think, had ever accused Judge Phillips of letting his law clerks write an opinion for him. He was an amazing man. I was his law clerk for 2 years. I guess that was a part of me not looking for jobs too. But he allowed me to be law clerk for 2 years. I don't think he ever did that again. And And I never heard that man say anything bad about but one person. There was a former United States attorney in Nashville, and I don't know what the problem was, but that is the only person that I ever heard Judge Mary Phillips say the negative word about. Everything else, you know, he was always complimentary and supportive of.
Did you feel it was because the person was incompetent, or was it a political thing? What was the
I think
nature
it was
of
a combination of politics and incompetency. I think that this was a combination of things. And I'm sure Judge Phillips, of course, had been Albert Gore's statewide campaign manager.
And that possibly had something to do with him getting the judge.
I think that had something to do with it. Yes, I think that was really the source. But that's the only man I ever heard him criticize, be it lawyers or other judges. Certainly would never say anything about another judge. And you know, every now and again, even at the Sixth Circuit level, there would be people that would appear before the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals that were just totally unprepared, had no idea what the case was about. And, you know, you'd make something about that. And Judge Phillips' response is, well, you know, you really don't know what kind of load they're carrying. You really don't know what kind of problems they have. You don't know how many cases they've got. And always defended everybody except that one individual.
What a wonderful lesson to learn.
Absolutely.
For you, a future judgeship. Because
absolutely.
I always felt that all you had to do to be a good judge was be polite to people, you know, give your opinions,
right,
and not belittle people.
Exactly, and that is exactly right. It is exactly right.
It has to be the easiest job in the world.
Right, right. I mean, you know, and one of the great things to learn is they may not be telling you anything, but you know, just be polite, or ask them to move on to another point, or, you know, I think you need to deal with this. In contrast, there was one of the judges that I got pretty close to because I was great friends with his law clerk, was Judge George Edwards in Michigan. Extremely bright fellow. I think he'd been a Harvard graduate. And Judge Edwards was just the opposite.
He could be testy, to say the least.
Ooh, you know, I guess he'd been a labor organizer, and I think was maybe mayor of Detroit. Now he could be testy, and I know we'll forget on one occasion where an assistant United States attorney came in and was arguing a case and did not respond to Judge Edwards directly to his question, and Judge Edwards said, well, now let me tell you something. Until you answer my question, there's not any point in you going on to anything else. I mean, whatever was on Judge Edwards' mind, he expressed it. Now, Judge Phillips would have never said that. Judge Phillips also taught me lots of things, but one other thing that I'd never appreciated until I guess I got into private practice. And it used to just irritate me to death. Very frequently, late in the day, Judge Phillips, I'll just use this as an example, I mean, it happened in other areas too, he would come in and there would be a mailing to the clerk in Cincinnati of an opinion or whatever. But every time that man came in and did that, he would come to my desk and he would hand me the envelope and his instructions, and I'm overblowing this just a bit, but he would say, now, take this envelope, go up here to the door, and go out in the hall, and go down to the elevators, and punch the elevator button, and get on the elevator, and then when you get to the first floor, get off, and go down the hall over to the post office and drop it in the box. Now, that was the way that Judge Phillips gave his directions or his instructions to you. And I thought, man, surely to goodness I figured out by this time about how to get to the post office. But somewhere along the way, Judge Phillips had been involved with some staff members that their duties and their instructions should have been clear, and they had not performed well. And consequently, he had developed the practice and the habit, and Judge Phillips was very disciplined and followed his procedures and practices very carefully. That's the way he dealt with staff or anybody that he was going to give instructions to. Now, obviously, it wasn't quite as I have told it, but that was one of the greatest things that I learned, because subsequently I learned that, particularly after I went into private practice, don't ever think that you were just going to hand something to somebody and it was going to come back or be handled the way you really wanted to. You know, if it insulted them, it just had to insult them if you gave them very careful instructions.
So in 1966, that would have been the end of 2 years.
Right.
Had you?
I still had not done a great deal about pursuing a job, and Judge Phillips had been in the State Attorney General's office both before and after World War II. And he thought that was the greatest place in the world. I mean, I'm telling you, he would tell stories about the old attorney generals and the Supreme Court justices and so forth. And of course, he knew all those people. By that time, he had been the editor of Pritchard's on Wheels and had quite a reputation in that area. He said, you know, what you ought to do, you ought to go to the Attorney General's office. You know, that's the greatest experience. And then he would go and tell me about all of the experiences and what he had done in the State Attorney General's office. And I thought, well, you know, obviously I'm going to have to leave here for too many months, so that's probably what I ought to do. And so he asked me if he wanted, if I wanted him to call Judge George McCandless, Attorney General George McCandless at that point, and see if there were any openings or set up anything. So I said, yeah, sure, I'd appreciate that. So he called Judge General McCandless, and then I contacted General McCandless's office and had his secretary send me the application form and filled out the application form. And of course, you know, you needed 3 or 4 recommendations. And so I tried to think of all of the politicians that I knew at that point. One of my friends in law school was Maurice Bowen, who ended up practicing law in Chattanooga, had married the daughter of the Commissioner of Corrections, Keith Hampton. And we were good friends, and I'd met Commissioner Hampton and so forth, and I don't remember who else I conjured up to write down there. But I was trying to get all of my politics right. In that day, politics or knowing the right people, I guess, did have a great effect on what happened.
And this was a Democratic
This
state.
was a Democrat, yes, that's right. George McCandless was a Democrat. Matter of fact, I believe that General McCandless had been the Commissioner of Revenue under Governor Prentice Cooper. And I believe Governor Cooper is the representative's father, isn't he?
That's correct.
Yeah. And of course was a Democrat. And McCandless was a Democrat. One of the most frugal men that I had ever met to that point in my life, and I guess even to this point in my life, George McCandless, and he took care of the state's money just like he took care of his money. And I know he had, as the old saying, the first nickel he ever made. And it turned out that some of that came from Prentice Cooper, who apparently was very conservative with his funds also. But anyway, I made the appointment, walked in, handed my application to General McCandless, and
So there were, I mean, the secretary, did you just walk in?
well, no, it was secretary. I went
Okay.
to secretary, and
how many assistants did he have?
at that point there were I believe 6 assistants, 5 or 6 assistants in the state attorney general's office.
And they were in the Supreme Court
They
building,
were on the
weren't
second
they?
floor of the Supreme Court building. General McCandless and all of his staff were on the second floor. Called the secretary, made an appointment, went to the office. The secretary took me in to see General McCandless, and I handed him my resume and paperwork and so forth. And before the man said anything, he was very short-spoken and direct. He said, "Oh, well, I don't need to look at that." He said, "If Harry Phillips recommends you, you're all right. When do you want to start to work?" That was the extent of my interview.
Not quite like it is today.
Not quite like it is today. I think they've got like 150 people over there. So I became the 7th. General McCandless had gotten 2 additional positions. And you can be sure that he desperately needed them, and of course he did. After I got there, I found out that he desperately needed 2 additional assistants because it was during that period of time that the post-conviction habeas corpus petitions were flooding the federal courts, which was a lot of what we had done at the Sixth Circuit. I mean, you know, there were dozens of them every session of court. And the state of Tennessee had no post-conviction relief act at that point. General McCandless had to hire some outside people just to take care of the federal court practice. David McMackin was one of them, and he went with the same. He was appointed at the same time I was. He got the other vacancy. And Bob Dedman, and I don't remember who else here in Nashville was handling all of the federal court work. But David McMackin and I became the 7th and 8th members of the staff that it now takes 150 to handle. But now we didn't have consumer or lots of those other things. And General McCandless was not going to go out and look for any additional duties. But as a young assistant, I came in just at the time that Tennessee adopted the Post-Conviction Relief Act. Henry Fouch, who was one of Judge Phillips' fast friends, never 2 people more opposite than Henry Fouch and Harry Phillips. Judge Phillips was quiet and I never heard the man say a curse word in his life, or in the 2 years that I was with him. Didn't drink. Henry would take a drink every now and again, and he would have a real hard time making 2 sentences without a few O's in the middle. But one of the greatest people in the world, and he and Judge Phillips were just fast friends. Which speaks to both of them, I think. Fauci's abilities. And Henry and I became very close because he was dealing with all the federal habeas corpus matters, and so I got assigned all of the post-conviction relief cases that went to the state Supreme Court, and you know the Attorney General even still today handles all the criminal matters at the appellate level for all of the state of Tennessee, and represents the agencies and departments of insurance. I got my share of 2 or 3 or 4 of those, and but I got all of those cases, and I would always have anywhere from 15 to 30 cases on the docket wherever we were going, and as I remember, we had 6 or 7 sessions a year in Nashville, Knoxville, and Jackson. And so sometimes those came up back to back, and so I got a lot of experience writing briefs during that period of time.
So how long were you with them?
I was with the Attorney General for about 4.5, 5 years. Sitting in my office minding my own business one day, and I got a call from Judge Frank Gray, and I'd gotten to know Judge Gray pretty well, having been on Judge Phillips was on the 6th floor, and he was on the 8th floor. And Judge Gray and Judge Phillips were very close friends. Judge Gray had been Estes Kefauver's statewide campaign manager, and so
that perhaps had something.
That had something to do with the relationship. The other judge by that time was Judge Clerk Morton from Knoxville, and of course Judge Morton was a Republican, as you know, and so
he had been Senator Baker's statewide.
He had, and
campaign
had been,
or finance.
Yeah, finance, I believe. Okay. He was Barry Goldwater's state campaign manager, and used to pride himself in telling me that, and Barry Goldwater was too liberal for me, which, if and I know you do, anybody knows much about Barry Goldwater. There wasn't anybody much more conservative than Barry Goldwater, I don't think.
Let me ask you that I practiced never before Judge Gray,
right,
but a lot before Judge Morton, and I knew he was a Republican, but I never sensed his politics, which is a tribute to him.
Absolutely. Absolutely, and that is exactly right.
Okay,
that is exactly right. He absolutely did not let politics enter into his courtroom demeanor or his treatment of lawyers or anything like that. I mean, Judge Morton was interested in performance, and my second term as bankruptcy judge, Judge Morton reappointed me as bankruptcy judge. But now he was demanding from the standpoint of competence. I mean, when you appeared before Judge Morton, you were prepared. If you weren't prepared, you probably had some trouble.
So you got the call from Judge Gray?
I got the call from Judge Gray, and Judge Gray said, "Would you have any interest in being a United States Magistrate?" And Judge Gray, who was a very matter-of-fact sort of a person, said, I said to Judge Gray, I said, "Judge, what is a United States Magistrate?" I'd never heard of a United States Magistrate, didn't even know there was such a thing. Oh, he said, Congress just passed this act to have United States Magistrates in all the judicial districts. And he said it's to replace the old commissioner system. And he said, you can read about that in Title 28. I don't know what they do other than what a commissioner did. Now the commissioner, A.B. Neal was a commissioner in Nashville. There was a commissioner in Columbia Jim Du Bois, and then there was a commissioner in Clarksville, part-time commissioner. And primarily what commissioners did was issue search warrants, arrest warrants. I think they occasionally would set bonds and things of that nature, but it was basically the, I guess, the general sessions equivalent of the federal system. So he said, you read Title 28. What United States magistrates will ultimately do is still up for determination. So I read that, and I guess the most influential factor was the fact that I believed that at that point I'd progressed to the point of making $17,500 at the AG's office, and this position paid $22,500, and $5,000 was in. You're not supposed to take jobs for money, but that was very enticing, and so I accepted that position and became the first United States magistrate in the Middle District of Tennessee. I guess we've got 4 now. Subsequently, the Sixth Circuit Judge Paul White wrote an opinion that just about struck magistrates off the books in the Sixth Circuit there for a while. It was primarily the issue of what required the action of a Article III judge, some of the same things that you and I have faced with in the bankruptcy court arena, but basically it kind of restricted us as to what we were to do, and except to conduct preliminary hearings, issue search warrants, arrest warrants. I used to get stacks of cases from Judge Morton and Judge Gray because the district court reviewed the decisions of Social Security Administration and write memorandum for them. I guess I was functioning as a law clerk as much as anything. They oftentimes accepted my conclusions without edit more often than Judge Phillips did as his law clerk. But we did. I did a lot of that.
I always felt that they were very good at delegating responsibilities to competent people if it was within the scheme they were dealing with, and relied on folks to do things, and were not jealous of position or turf. And
that is 100% correct from working the years that I did with them, and from the creation of the United States Magistrate's Office, or the United States, what are they, magistrate judges, I believe they're officially called now, and bankruptcy judges. That was quite a point of concern in 1978 when the Congress rewrote the bankruptcy law, and all of a sudden referees in bankruptcy were given the title of bankruptcy judge. In lots of districts, there was a lot of jealousy involved. Such things as the bankruptcy judges couldn't ride the same elevators as the district judges, had to wear different colored robes. Judge Morton, Judge Gray, they appointed what they believed to be competent people, and you would never have any interference with them from that day forward.
I always felt they were collegial, they respected you.
Absolutely.
They gave you as much dignity as they could, and it was so unlike so many of the districts we heard about around the country.
Totally supportive of the magistrates and of the judges. No interference, no effort to have any input into the hirings in the clerk's office or your secretaries or any other personnel. All they were interested in was, you do your job, and as long as nobody says anything to me about the magistrate or the bankruptcy court, you won't hear anything from me either. But door was completely open. I spent lots of time in both positions, sitting and talking to Judge Gray and Judge Morton, and it wasn't necessarily about cases that we were involved in, just listening to them tell war stories.
And they had great war stories. Well, how long were you a magistrate?
I was a magistrate for about 18 months and was minding my own business in my magistrate's office, probably working on a Social Security memo. And Judge Gray called and said, come up here, I want to talk to you. And I thought, oh me, wonder what I didn't do. And I got up there and he said, well, Judge Morton and I have been talking, and Judge Bates is going to retire. Previously, Judge Ruth Kennard had been appointed to the position as the second bankruptcy judge for the district. And Judge Morton and I want to appoint you as a bankruptcy judge. You know, we have a few concerns about, we want to be sure that it's treated as a court, and we want to be sure that creditors are getting the money that they should have, and there's not too much cliquey clubbishness in the bankruptcy court and so forth, and we want to appoint you a bankruptcy judge. And I can remember that conversation very, very distinctly. I said, hell, Judge. We had become pretty close by that point that I said, only thing I know about bankruptcy is that the bankruptcy hearing room is right across the hall from my office as a United States Magistrate. And I said, I see these people going in and out. I said, I have no idea what in the world they're doing over there. I don't know anything about bankruptcy. I confess that in the summer, I took creditors' rights under one of my favorite professors at Vanderbilt, Paul Hartman. Never a feel as to what was going on in the course. I just, learned enough to answer the exam questions. And he said, oh, damn it, Jennings, the way he would talk, had that cigar in his mouth. He never saw Judge Gray in his office without a cigar in his mouth. You can learn it. And well, he had answered that question that I had raised, and I believe that that involved a $2,500 increase because the bankruptcy judges at that point had a heck of a relationship with Congress and with an administrative office, and so they were making $2,500 more than a magistrate. And I guess if they'd been making $2,500 less than a magistrate, I would have been a bankruptcy judge. After the appointing official, at that time the bankruptcy judges were appointed by the district judges. Since they appointed both the magistrates and the bankruptcy judge, I probably would have taken it either way.
And so you went over to the bankruptcy court, or to the bankruptcy court, which was still located in the Kefauver building. In the Kefauver building on the 7th floor, and in quite cramped spaces, and we were spread out all the way down the floor. Judge Kennard's office and her courtroom was at the other end of the hall. The clerk's office was here, and the files were all here. It was a very disjointed sort of an arrangement. You went through remarkable changes, not so much as in the magistrate's position, but in the bankruptcy judge position, and I want you to talk about that, but also talk a little bit about Judge Kennard, because unfortunately we'll never take her history, and this is your opportunity to talk a little bit about serving with her and her tenure as a judge. Yeah, Judge Kennard and I worked together for 6 years. Judge Kennard was one of the most remarkable people that I guess I ever had the opportunity to work with.
Judge Kennard, I guess you said earlier that Harry Phillips was the model of the Southern gentleman, and Ruth Kennard, I think, was probably the model of the Southern lady. Mm-hmm. Most gracious person I have think I've ever been around. Knew everyone in the world. Was diligent in all of her cases and being prepared. Knew a lot of people that turned out to be very helpful and beneficial after we became the bankruptcy judges. Excuse me. Because one of the things that we did was to try to expand the persons that were serving as trustees. And of course, Judge Kennard had graduated from Vanderbilt after I had. She'd been in the trust department of one of the banks. I don't remember which one, Commerce Union maybe.
Commerce Union.
Yeah. She was very helpful in the trustee appointments of knowing people. She and I never had a disagreement about anything that I'm aware of. She's not here to defend herself, so. And I think and was very interested in the things that I was interested in. For example, in expanding Chapter 13s. Judge Kennard handled the 13 docket when I was there. The years that she was there, I subsequently did. But and we were very fortunate in talking now bankruptcy judge Keith London into becoming the Chapter 13 trustee, and Judge Kennard, of course, knew Judge London, and I had known Judge London because he had been Judge Phillips' law clerk after I was appointed to the bankruptcy bench, and we had conversations on a couple of bankruptcy opinions that Judge Phillips had drawn. One of which you probably remember was Clearware, mm-hmm. which became the opinion as it related to fixing attorney's fees. And Judge London and I had a lot of conversation, and we appointed Judge London as the Chapter 13 trustee, and that was one of the things that we really were interested in developing. Very, very few Chapter 13 cases at the time. Judge Kennard and I went on the bench, and I say we went on the bench because I believe she mm-hmm. went on in August and I went on in September. So we were neophytes together, and there had to be some groundwork laid. I mean, there was some work that needed to be done, and it had to come from the judges, and it also had to come from the Chapter 13 trustee and how he was going to handle the creditor's money and so forth. And Judge London did a great job on that. We changed a lot of the trustee appointments and so forth, and I guess a lot of people got kind of upset with us about some of that. But she was one of the easiest and best people to work with that I think I have had an opportunity to work with, and I was blessed with all of the people that the bankruptcy judges that I worked with. But Ruth was just a prince of a lady and was extremely diligent in everything that she did.
What are some of the big cases you remember that are in the law was changing, the court structure
yeah.
was
One
changing?
of the things that happened in our tenure there in 1978 was Congress passed a completely new bankruptcy law. Now, you know, Congress has been known to amend things, but this time they wrote a whole new bankruptcy law. That we were operating initially under the Bankruptcy Act, which was the Bankruptcy Act of 1898 that had been amended substantially in 1938, I believe. I think we got on a 40-year cycle there. And then it was completely rewritten in 98 to give the...
In 78.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's right.
98,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I jumped way ahead, didn't
Yeah.
I? 78, yeah. You know, it created, I mean, they were all of a sudden called bankruptcy judges, all of a sudden had national rules like the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure and things of that nature.
They had a clerk's office that
Had a clerk's
you had
office.
to create.
Absolutely, had to create a clerk's office. And, you know, Ruth Kennard was right in her element when it came to doing things like setting up a clerk's office and creating a clerk's office. Now she was great at administration too, which was not one of my strong points. I guess the thing that really fit right in with all of this was just before that, in 1974, I guess the first real blast that we had was the filing of the General Transportation Services case, which was a huge case, not just Nashville, but nationwide, that Cormac Cochran was the lead counsel, and Ray Busey, who was not too many years out of law school, I guess, got his break in with bankruptcy law, and he's never gotten over it because that's his. You never get away from bankruptcy after GTS. It had 132 subsidiaries, 32 subsidiaries. It involved all of the Billy Wilson trucking companies like Wilco Leasing and General Truck Sales, the big GMC dealership that you probably remember. And they'd gotten in some financing with the Provident Insurance Company, and it's my recollection that there were about 11,000 creditors. Now, I ended up with drawing that case. I'm not sure that I was quite ready for that after 18 months or so on the bankruptcy bench, but you know, it's one of those things, you know, it's there, and so you got to deal with it. That I think probably had the greatest effect on the change of bankruptcy practice in Nashville. I guess I'm sure there are lots of other things, including the number of cases, and then subsequently there have been some big ones. But all of a sudden there were people appearing in bankruptcy court that previously didn't know which floor the bankruptcy court was on. Like Russ Morris. Russ represented General Motors in that particular case, and spent lots of hours with Russ Morris from Bassberry. And when we were appointing trustees, you'll get a kick out of this, or knowing Brad Reed. But I called Brad Reed and talked Brad Reed into letting me appoint him as a bankruptcy trustee. And Brad agreed, which I guess that's the shocking thing. Now, what won't shock you is that Brad may have appeared at one docket and all of a sudden he started sending John Bailey over here, and of course Bailey became greatly involved in bankruptcy cases. But you know, Billy Waller and those kind of people started appearing in bankruptcy court, and well that they did, because the bankruptcy business started booming shortly after that. And then
nothing like having money to make the lawyers follow
that's
the
true.
practice. Yeah.
That's true.
Oddly enough,
all of
that
a sudden,
is, yeah.
It's amazing what things like GTS would do as far as all of them. You know, General Motors needed lawyers here as well as factors from New York and so forth. So all of a sudden you saw bankruptcy departments develop in the law firms.
Now, Ruth only served one term.
One term.
And then
Russell Hippie.
And that was when? Do you recall?
That was in, that would have been in 78.
Okay.
We had 6-year terms. And Judge Morton appointed Russell Hippie in 78.
And he stayed on for 3 years until...
Russell left either in late 81 or early 82, just before I did.
Since I was appointed in October 15th of 1981, that would be about the time.
Must have been then, because that's right. That's right. That's right. I remember.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. You came on and when Russell left, I remember that I went to Judge Wiseman and said that I was thinking about leaving the bankruptcy court, and his response was, "Well, oh, not for a while," because Russell Hippie has just resigned.
Yeah. Well, and that might have been after they had put me on, because I knew even less bankruptcy than you did when you were.
No, there's no way you could have known less, because I can remember one case at least that you were involved in prior to that time, but it may have been shortly after that.
I was trustee in one case, and I had one consumer case.
Okay, the trustee case was the one that I remember that you had some great experiences with trying to repossess boats or something somewhere. Yeah.
So we overlapped until
I left in May of 82, which was when Judge London was appointed.
Enough for me to take the training wheels off, and then you.
Oh yeah, by that time you had everything under control. You came in with your feet on the floor and.
Well, only because I acted like I did, but I certainly didn't. Okay. So well, I don't want to hear anybody ever say I did.
All right. Well, so you and I have that in common, that we came in just a little bit green in the bankruptcy field.
So you left the bankruptcy court in '82, and
I went to Waddy in Newport.
Right.
Judge London came out of that firm. I believe, Judge London was at Waddy in Newport and took my position, and I went to Waddy in Newport. And didn't take his position because he represented the liquor industry, and I knew absolutely nothing about that. And he had given Hank Hildebrand some background in Chapter 13 matters, and I think y'all appointed Hank to succeed Judge London as the Chapter 13 trustee.
And how long were you with the Waddy firm?
I was with the Waddy firm for, I believe, about 10 or 12 years. And it kind of imploded, exploded, or people went their separate ways. Darrell West had gone on his own, and a fellow that had also been a Phillips law clerk by the name of Dan Kaufman had gone back to Washington, or maybe he'd gone to Washington and come back to Nashville. I don't remember, but Dan left and went to Washington. That's what happened. And
he's since died, hadn't he?
Yes, Dan Kaufman since died. Now there's an individual that was well worth knowing. I've never known anything like Dan Kaufman. He had truly a photographic memory, and his hobby was reading advance sheets, and he read all the Fed Sups and Fed Seconds and Supreme Court and Tennessee Southwest Reporter advance sheets, and could remember case names and rules of law and holdings like nobody I have ever seen in my life. But yes, Dan died. One more amazing, amazing lawyer.
So after the implosion,
we went. By that point, Randall Mashburn who had been Judge Connor's law clerk, was with us, and Beth Derrick, who had been my law clerk, was with us. And so Beth and Randall and I went down to Second and Church and opened up an office, and it was Jennings, Derrick, and Mashburn. We stayed together. I can't remember how long we stayed together. 6 or 7 years, 5 or 6 years anyway. And Beth left, and Jim Lane, who was your law clerk, joined us. And I guess Randall left first and went to Baker.
With Judge Connor.
Yeah. And then it was Jennings, Derrick, and Lane. Then Beth shortly went to the United States Trustee's office. And then it became Jennings, Lane, and Raymer. Elaine Raymer had been an associate. She had an office in Murfreesboro, and we joined forces there. And when I eventually moved to Murfreesboro, as a matter of fact, after Jim Lane went to Tullahoma.
So are you still practicing?
I'm still practicing, yeah.
It's solo or still?
Solo, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm.
And what's it like being in the country now after having been in the city for so long?
Well, I don't see a whole lot of change. Of course, I guess I was somewhat unique in that most of my business has always come from lawyer referrals and people that I'd handle cases for. Frankly, the reason I went to Murfreesboro was it occurred to me that, if more than likely any case I get in the bankruptcy world is not going to walk in off the street, because there are other people that are advertising and so forth that are going to get that. And I really wasn't working too diligently on wanting 7s and 13 cases, or consumer cases, primarily involved in business cases. And they can come to Murfreesboro, and I won't have to drive I-24 every morning, and so I decided to stop in Murfreesboro.
So when you go to court, are you going to court in Winchester?
I'm going to court, yeah.
And Nashville.
And in Nashville,
now. Winchester being in the Eastern District.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me talk briefly about your children. You've been the platform or the nexus for all sorts of people who went on the bench or became involved in the bankruptcy process. But how many children do you have, and what are they doing now?
I have 3. One is at Bassbury and Sims, and is in the bankruptcy field.
And a very prominent bankruptcy lawyer, and well-loved lawyer, so.
I appreciate that. My daughter, Stephanie Edwards, is also a lawyer. She was in the Waller firm, and her primary person that she worked with, and Brian Howard and Jeff Mobley formed a boutique estate tax firm, and she's with them out in, I think they're in Green Hills now. Mm-hmm. My third child, who would have been the last one in the world I would have expected, is in the organic farming business.
Where?
In Laverne. He married a young lady in Laverne that was in the beginning stages of organic farming. They had greenhouses and so forth, and was growing sprouts and wheatgrass and all those kind of things. And so they're growing that and selling it in Chattanooga and Atlanta and all around Nashville. And he's expanded over into the produce area also. So.
And how many grandchildren do you have?
I have 4. Paul, my oldest one at Bassbury, has 2 daughters. One that is graduating from high school this year, and one that's a sophomore, I believe. Then Stephanie has a little boy that is 4, and Pascal and his wife had one 3 weeks ago, I guess.
Wow.
A daughter.
Let me ask as a final question, and I knew you as a judge, and I knew you as a lawyer who practiced before me. You always had the ability to focus in on the issue that was paramount to the case. You didn't chase rabbit tracks as so many lawyers do, and you were very convincing. You were very good as a judge because of that, because you went right to the heart of the case. But also, you did that as a lawyer, and you were very convincing to a judge such as myself. Where do you think you got this ability, or, I mean, did you sense that, or?
Well, yeah, and I don't know exactly where I got that. I think all of my training had something to do with that. Judge Phillips was very insistent on, regardless of how many issues were raised on appeal, let's get down to the one that really makes a difference about whether there's been error in this case. Judge Gray was extremely insistent on that. Don't know whether you ever had opportunity to watch Judge Gray perform. I'll use that word with reservation. But when Judge Gray got upset, and one of the things that would get him upset would be if somebody wanted to come in and tell him a lot of stuff that didn't make any difference about the case. And he's been known to turn around and stare at the seal, and if that didn't work, come back around and as you know, those benches in the district courtrooms are very long, and he's been known to toss his glasses a time or two, and they'd trickle all the way down to the other end. So I guess that made an impression on me. My Attorney General's experience had impact there too, because at that point there was no Tennessee Court of Criminal Appeals. The state Supreme Court heard all the criminal cases, and well, they insisted on that. And then, as you did after you came on the court. Boy, it doesn't take you long if you're the judge sitting there to know that they really don't want to hear you talk about something that has little relevance or no relevance to the case, and they really don't want to hear you make a jury speech to them. And that's
Well,
when
few lawyers learn that lesson, and you just knew it in spades. Is there anything that I didn't ask you about that you'd just like to record for posterity?
I don't know that you have left out anything,
Okay.
Judge, that would be of a great benefit to posterity.
Well,
I think you've covered the history very well.
Well, thank you for doing this. We appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate it.